Good morning everyone. I know a few of these faces here and you've seen me around. So obviously today's on Greyhound Sports Nutrition. Now I apologise that there's a lot of non-Greyhound photos. This was a very quick Google image job before we came down, trying to get some photos to put in, so don't be too offended. So to begin with is my background and really why should you listen to anything that I have to say. And I guess I'll tell you how I started. So two and a half years ago I started with Greyhound racing. It was about 4:30 in the afternoon and one of the vets had just rolled his car and they basically were desperate for someone to cover, and they called up every vet in the area pretty much, and everyone said no, I'm not going to do it. And I was like, yeah, I'll give it a crack, and I had no idea at all what I was doing. And so I rocked up at Bulleye and I've got my stethoscope on and the thermometer out, and there are pre-kennel checks, and all of you would know Jim, I'm assuming, at Bulleye. And I'm sitting there with my little stethoscope and trying to have a listen to everything and really just making an absolute idiot of myself. And I guess the point is that I haven't been doing this for a whole lot of time, and I really don't have the experience that a lot of you have. So I'm not going to give you any opinions in this presentation at all. So everything that I present to you today is basically just research that has happened into dogs and where possible greyhounds regarding nutrition. So there's only one time I'll give an opinion, and I'll flag that for you.
Thank you.
And so even as recently as I was at Bulleye on Friday, and we had a dog there with just a sore hock, and for the life of me, really obviously Lane went up and down that leg and couldn't find it, and the trainer, who obviously knew that dog backwards, admittedly he knew that dog had fractured its hock a few years ago, but still I'm happy to be proven wrong, and I'm quite aware that I guess as vets we are a little bit prone to kind of giving our opinion as fact, and it's something that I'm trying not to do today, and if I do it, just pull me up. So, as I mentioned, the whole topic today is about evidence-based medicine, and basically that means whenever you make a decision with regards to anything in medicine, having evidence for it, and basically that means using the best evidence. So anecdotally we'll say, I've been doing this with my dogs for 10 years and it's worked. That's good evidence, but if we could get really strong kind of comparing not doing it to doing it and blinding it, so not knowing which one's the treatment group and all that sort of thing, we can kind of make our decisions more informed. Now the problem is, it's really good when we've got all that data and that research, but unfortunately there's not a whole lot of money being poured into Greyhound research, and we just don't have a lot of evidence for some of the things that we try to do. So really good, and where possible we'll try to do that, but I guess just because something's anecdotal and and we kind of poo-poo that, that's not what evidence-based medicine is about. So the goals of nutrition, we want objective goals, and really they're minimising injury and maximising performance. So maximising performance means obviously speed. We want those dogs to get around the track in as little time as possible, and that's really it. Following on from that, they need strength, so what they need to do is physically carry themselves, and we need stamina so they can maintain that speed. We want to minimise injury, so there's lots of things that we call injury, and obviously not all of them are true injuries, but so the first one is simply foodborne illness, so things like salmonella, crypto, all those bacteria and viruses that can be in our food, we want to eliminate them, we don't want them to happen. Drug contamination, I'm sure everyone is aware that procaine penicillin, if you've got some down the cow that's gone to the knackery, could potentially be in your food, and it's a real worry for trainers. There is some regulations that happen, but unfortunately it seems that some animals get through the nets, and we probably can't have that much confidence in a lot of pet meat that doesn't have drugs in it, unfortunately. Dehydration is something that probably doesn't get enough attention as it should. Hypothermia, so the temperature being too hot, is something that, again, is significant, and nutrition can actually influence that. Myoglobinuria, so myoglobinuria is the fancy term for when your dog goes and does a piss and it's that red colour, so that's what we call that. And technically that's a sign of injury. We're actually seeing the muscle cells being damaged and leaking that red colour or that red dye. Muscle injury, obviously, and orthopaedic injury, so fractured bones and damaged bones and dislocations. So I'm a huge nerd, and I've been at uni this is my 9th year straight of full-time study. So muscles are really what we're trying to feed. We want the muscles to be as healthy as possible, and when you look at a muscle, what it really comes down to is something that looks like this. And basically these little purple things pull on this red thing, and that's what makes your dog work, and that's an actin filament, myosin filament, and that's an actin filament, and that's what it comes down to. So you want those things to be working really healthily, and you basically have to just give them energy to make that happen, and that's what it comes down to. You want as many of those as strong as possible. You line them up in parallel, and it makes it stronger and stronger, and that's how we do it. and then we've got to give them the energy to actually let them do their job, and it's that simple. So the big thing when we're looking at our dogs is what sort of metabolism. So metabolism is the word that we use to describe how we unlock the energy from food, and then how we then give that energy to our muscles to use that energy. So it's, there's two types, it's aerobic and anaerobic. So air is Latin for, surprise, surprise, air, and so N means no. So we've got aerobic metabolism, which means that there's lots of air available, and there's anaerobic metabolism, which means there's no air, or the muscle's kind of suffocating. What we want to do is we want to maximise on both of these. Everyone talks about aerobic, and that's kind of fitness, and if you look at a marathon runner, they've got really good aerobic metabolism. But we'll look later that we don't want to discard this one, because we can get we can value add to the speed of the dogs by kind of upping both of them. So, but in general, we want to maximise our aerobic metabolism as much as possible, because anaerobic metabolism is the type that actually causes lots of the injuries that we see in tying up and cramps and myoglobin or the red urine. So it really is relevant to kind of realise what we're trying to do. So when we look at muscle, I know this is really nerdy and complicated, and I apologise, but there's two types of muscle fibres or muscle cells, type 1 and type 2. Type 1 is really good at using that aerobic metabolism that uses oxygen out of that they're breathing in. And type 2 is kind of the anaerobic one that doesn't use the oxygen as much. And the take-home message is basically that type 1 fibres, they're the ones that create a long stamina, they can run for hours on them. The type 2 are really quick, they're the ones that you use in sprinting, and we want to maximise both of these guys. So these ones though, the problem with them is that they tend to, if we feed just these guys, they make our dogs more likely to tie up and to cramp and potentially injure our muscles. If we feed just the type 1 muscles, then we've got dogs with lots of stamina that are really fit, but they're actually not that speedy. They can run for hours, but they don't have that bursty speed as they come out of the boxes. So we actually, by picking the nutrients that we put in our diet, we can selectively feed these guys, so it is relevant. Now, basically, all our muscles need energy, and that's what we're doing by feeding them. And all of the energy for every single cell in the body, or every single thing that needs energy in the body, comes from a single molecule, which is called ATP. And so basically, what our body does is converts all the food that we eat into this thing. And every single thing that happens uses this. It doesn't matter what nutrient it is, you feed fat or protein or carbs or whatever, it all gets turned into this thing, and that's kind of like the petrol for our cells. But depending on what type of feed we use, fat or protein or carbs, we can actually make this thing more efficiently, or we can make it selectively for those different types of cells. So just remembering that what we're trying to make is this at the end of the day, and it depends on what we feed as to how we make that. So as we've mentioned, that you can use all these different types of foods to make that product. Now all I want to say here is that if we use fats and proteins, we tend to go down an aerobics, that one with oxygen pathway, and if we use carbohydrates, we're at risk of producing lactic acid. So I'm sure everyone's heard of lactic acid before. And the problem with carbs is that they're really good at feeding those type 2 cells, which are the really fast, speedy sprint cells, but their downside, as we've talked about, is that they favour that tying up and that cramping pathway because they're favouring lactic acid and because they're not using as much oxygen as we go. So at the end of the day, we can make ATP from whatever we want, but depending on what we're making it from, does have some quite real consequences on the muscle tissue. So when you look at a muscle cell, now you go for a run, and you come out of the boxes, this is a person, so the times aren't completely correct, obviously you're not running for 250 seconds in a race. But as soon as you come out, you've just got ATP that's already made, and you just use it, it's sitting there, it's ready to go, you just eat it up. Then you can start using this blue line, which is carbs, so you can start breaking down some preformed carbs to make ATP. And then you can use this green one, which is the aerobic one, which is basically using fats and a little bit of carbs to make your energy. But you can see that as you come out, most of our energy is coming from this red one, which is what's already made in the muscle, and this green one, which is carbs. But if we run for a little bit longer, these guys run out really quickly, and all we're left with is the green. So we don't want to favour one pathway over the other, and if we do that, we'll find that we either lose our bursty, rapid sprint potential, or we find that we fatigue really quickly. And what we feed really does determine how it works. So the first thing with our diets is we want to know how much energy we're feeding them. And we want to know how much energy should we be giving a dog. And unfortunately, there's actually not a lot of evidence as to what you should be feeding your dog. So the guidelines say that you should be feeding them around about 7,000 kilojoules for a 30 kilogram dog, but really what you should be doing is just making up an ideal diet and then feeding your dog and going up and down until you get that ideal weight. So what you want to spend your time in is making up a big batch of your diet and then feeding it roughly at this level, but then titrating it up or down to just get that perfect weight. It doesn't matter how much you feed as long as you're at that ideal weight, because you've got all the other nutrients in the right proportion. So ideally you aim for this, but it doesn't really matter too much. So the first nutrient that we're going to talk about is protein. Now everyone would think that protein is the most important nutrient. We're feeding muscles, that's what bodybuilders take. They all take their protein shakes. It's actually not true, and I'm sure you've heard it before, but when we feed our diet, we want to feed about 25 to 30% of the energy as protein. Now if anyone's really serious about wanting to learn how to work out what's in their diet, they're more than welcome to come and chat to me. I'll go through it with them. But so don't worry too much about the numbers, just take home the bigger points, and I can go through the numbers with them more specifically later. But if we feed too much protein, we'll actually slow our race times. There's a little bit of evidence for that. It's not great data, but there is a little bit of evidence that by feeding too much protein, we actually slow our dogs. And there's quite good evidence that feeding too much protein actually lowers their hematocrit, which is their red blood cell count. So it makes them almost slightly anemic by giving them too much protein. So we don't want to overdo it, and it's not something that we just want to go really heavy-handedly with. And when we're feeding just whole meat diets, that's something that we have a real risk of doing. Now, too little protein will quite simply, our muscles are made of protein. If we don't feed enough, there won't be enough muscle. So if we don't feed enough protein, we'll get these really lean-looking dogs that don't have a lot of muscle on them, and they kind of look a bit skinny. And that's not what we want here. So we want to aim for that perfect range. Step 3 is fat. So this is really important, and probably the most important nutrient that there is. So greyhounds and dogs in general are designed to use fat. That's what they've evolved to use that, and they can use it probably maybe 20 times more efficiently than people. Their cells are really good at burning fat, and we should be feeding them fat as one of the biggest energy sources in their diet. Now, fat is quite energy dense, so it would be unusual. I guess when we say we need lots and lots of fat, it's easy for us to overdo it without realising, because I'm sure everyone knows that their dogs need fat, but by just adding a little bit of fat, it's so energy dense that you can really overdo it quite quickly. Okay, so one of the benefits of fat is that it really improves stamina. So it allows our dogs to run harder and run for longer, and it's actually protective of our muscles. So it reduces acidosis, so it stops them making that lactic acid. It stops them breaking down and actually damaging themselves and releasing those pigments. But the really good thing is it really lets them run longer. And dogs that aren't fit, they either haven't been trained enough, or potentially they're not fit because they're not getting the right diet. And increasing the amount of fat in the diet will improve fitness. And there's really good evidence from lots of studies that have shown this, and there's evidence in people as well that this is the case. So fat's really good, and it improves the fitness and the stamina, or the ability to maintain speed for dogs. And so, as Erkin said, there's really good evidence. Don't worry too much about the numbers at this stage. The only real downside is that there's so much energy in fat that without realising it, we can overdo it. And there's lots of evidence that dogs that are too fat, just by just a tiny bit, actually run slower. So we don't want to overfeed our animals. Carbohydrates. So that's the third nutrient that we can feed, or the third energy source. Now, basically, it doesn't matter what we do with these. You just kind of fill out the rest of your energy with them. But with carbs, they're the ones that give us that really bursty speed and that allow us to take off really quickly. And probably of all the things that we feed in our diet, carbs are probably the thing that we're underutilising at the moment. So there's evidence that if you feed a high carb diet long term, it reduces the dog's capacity to run. But in people, there's evidence that if you feed a high carb diet just before exercise, so in the 12 hours leading up, you can actually load the muscle tissue with energy. And potentially that's something that's underutilised in greyhound racing. There's not a lot of evidence in dogs, not that there's been studies saying it didn't work, there just hasn't been any research to look at it at all. So I think this is the only time I'll give my opinion as saying that it's probably worthwhile considering giving our dogs really high carb diets in the 12 hours before and the 12 hours after we race, and then the rest of the time having that high fat diet. But happy to be proven wrong on that. The downside of carbs, as we talked about, if we feed them too much carbs long term, all they have is that really bursty speed, and they run out of that really quickly. And when they run out of that, they have to use that anaerobic metabolism, which is what produces lactic acid, And lactic acid is what damages the muscle and makes it cramp and makes it die and causes all the issues that we can, and actually causes quite real issues, and you can tear muscles and do fractures and all sorts of things just from that lactic acid. So if we overdo carbs by replacing fat with carbs, long term it can be damaging, but in the short term it might actually be quite useful. Water is a nutrient that we really underappreciate, and something that we probably need to, both as trainers but also as GSW, be more aware of how we can improve or reduce the rates of dehydration in our dogs. So 1% dehydration in people increases the temperature by 0.5 degree. So going back to me being an idiot when I first started training, when I first started sticking thermometers in dogs after they've come off the track, I'm getting these temperatures of 41, 42, thinking, oh God, like these are all going to have heat stroke and die. So if I saw a little, chihuahua in practice with a temperature of 41 degrees, I'd admit it and put on fluids and just freak out, but obviously that's normal. But you can see that if we get to 42 in pretty much any animal, they usually start to die and get quite sick. So we haven't got a lot of wiggle room to go from 41 to 42. So our dogs kind of are used to coping with that high temperature, but we don't necessarily want to exacerbate it, and we want to reduce that hypothermia as much as possible. And the simplest way to do that is make sure that they're not dehydrated. So obviously making sure that they're as hydrated as possible going into the race, but on our end as well, we need to consider policies that improve hydration, and that's something that people are trying to do. Now, the big topic that we want to talk about is supplements. Now, this is a really blurry photo, but I'm sure you've all seen the tables at all the tracks that just have supplements everywhere, and just you can spend your money every which way. And the reason I wanted to do this was because Alan Proctor, I was at Wenty, and he was talking, and he was really offended about the inquiry because they were kind of portraying all the trainers as criminals, and he was like, look, I spend so much money on my dogs and I care about them so much, and I'm pouring $600 a week or something into supplements just to feed these guys, and they're saying that I don't give a crap about my dog. And I was like, that's really good, but if he's pouring that much money into supplements and things, maybe he's not getting bang for his buck, and maybe he actually be better spending his money doing other things, buying exercise machines or buying whatever, or you know what I mean? And so I wanted to look at the supplements, and when you actually look at the supplements that are available, you'll find that pretty much all of them basically are just vitamins, minerals and amino acids, and that's the vast majority of the supplements. And whether or not there's a lot of evidence for these is probably to be discussed. So I'm just going to put up a few that are up here. So I'm going to put up, to begin with, some supplements that are actually proven to be useful, that is worth feeding. So arginine is an amino acid, so it's like a little, if you imagine the protein's a big Lego house, it's one of the little Lego blocks that makes up the protein. When we feed high protein diets, we need arginine to utilise that protein, and because we feed greyhounds a higher protein diet than normal dogs, potentially normal dog food or normal feeds are deficient in arginine. So there's probably some benefit in giving an arginine level slightly above what we give normal animals. Carnitine. So carnitine is basically another amino acid, but what it does is, in people it's been shown to reduce atherosclerosis, which is that hardening of the vessels that leads to heart attacks and things. Now that doesn't happen in dogs purely because they don't live long enough to kind of get those. There's a disease that you get when you're 40 and above. But there's still some evidence in dogs that carnitine helps the blood vessels be healthy and be really open, and it improves oxygen transport, so oxygen being delivered to the muscle so they can use more energy. So again, there's a little bit of evidence for this one, not really good data, but in people there's quite good evidence for this. So it may be a supplement that, if you're giving, actually does have some value. Carnosine. Now this is basically two little amino acids stuck together, and what it does is it buffers the acid drop. So when you exercise, no matter what you do, you're going to generate lactic acid, and that basically is an acid, as it sounds like, and it kind of affects how the muscle function. It makes the muscle really stiff. So if you remember that picture of the two little bits kind of intertangling, it makes them stick together and not relax, and that's what a cramp is. So giving carnosine has actually shown to help stop that pH drop, and so there's good evidence for this in people. In dogs there's not a whole lot of research, not because it has been found not to work, but just no one's done the studies. Calcium. So everyone would obviously know why we feed calcium. It's to strengthen bones, but it also has lots of other functions in the body, and it's really important. Now, there's whether or not greyhounds need more calcium than normal dogs. There's really no good rock hard evidence to say that they do, but logically it makes sense. They're putting their bodies through more stress, there's more bone turnover and that sort of thing. So I mean, it's reasonable to say that they do, but there's just not a whole lot of good evidence. Now calcium is pretty safe, so to give a calcium supplement you're not going to harm your dog. The things to remember about calcium is that we all know that puppies need more calcium, but possibly in some of our sometimes we may actually overdo it. So in large breed dogs, giving too much calcium to puppies can actually be harmful. And now that's been shown in the really big breeds like Great Danes. Some people have kind of suggested that that may also be true in greyhounds, that by feeding them too much calcium, we can actually cause premature hardening of their bones and their joints can be damaged to, when they're young. So we want to feed, we'll just ignore this one so far. We want to feed our puppies much more calcium than our older dogs, but we don't want to overdo it. So just thinking that, oh, it's a puppy, I just need to put shovelfuls of calcium in, probably isn't correct. If you're already feeding a puppy feed or something like that, you want to be aware of how much calcium you're putting in, because by really overdoing it, you may actually be doing some harm. The next one is iron. So we need iron to make our red blood cells. So iron is a little atom that basically goes into the thing that makes our red blood cells red, and that's what carries the oxygen. Again, there's not a huge amount of evidence saying that the greyhounds need more iron than other dogs. There's a thing called sports anemia, which is in people, whereas basically athletes have higher rates of anemia than other people. And iron actually does help in that, and no one's really looked at sports anemia in greyhounds, but it makes sense that possibly they're experiencing the same thing. So it makes sense to give iron. It's safe as houses. The one thing to be aware of is that iron is really poorly absorbed. So our bodies, of what we eat, we probably absorb about 15% of the iron. The best iron is what we absorb from blood. So if we eat red meat and that sort of thing, we absorb it really well. If we give kind of iron supplements, then we absorb that terribly. If you're giving an iron oxide or carbonate salt, and you just look at the ingredients, you may as well just chuck that in the bin because it will literally do nothing. So it has to be one of these, a sulfate and a ascorbate or a chelate. And the reason I say this is because there's very little regulation in vet supplements, and so when someone can sell you iron oxide telling you it's a supplement, and just because it's crap doesn't mean that they've done anything legally wrong. So something else to be aware of is that lean beef actually doesn't have enough iron to meet the requirements of a dog. So there's really good evidence for giving iron supplements, and I'd say most of you are already doing it. Antioxidants. So antioxidants basically are these little molecules that protect our cells from being damaged by, ironically, by oxygen. So sometimes oxygen goes a little bit crazy and it starts to damage things. Now, everyone would say that we need to give our dogs antioxidants, and there's been heaps of people who've said that, and lots of our supplements, if you look at them, have antioxidants on there. There was one study that showed that giving too much vitamin C actually slowed dogs down. So it's not safe as houses, these things. When we give too much of these antioxidants, they actually become oxidants, and so they actually do the opposite of what they're expected to do, and they make it worse. So I've seen one supplement that has massive doses of vitamin C, and there's absolutely no evidence that it does any benefit, and there's actually evidence that it might do harm. So sometimes, I guess my point here is that just because something's a supplement and you can buy it and it says Greyhound, doesn't actually mean that you need to give it or that it's going to be doing you benefit. Vitamin E is another antioxidant. There's possibly a little bit of benefit if you're feeding fish oils and other, if you're adding, say, vegetable oil to your diet, but probably that evidence is really low, and it's unusual to get a diet that's deficient in these. Vitamin B12, so this is probably quite topical. Everyone's obviously heard about cobalt and being swab times and everything, and everyone who wasn't giving vitamin B12 is probably giving vitamin B12 because they've all heard about it now. So basically, what does vitamin B12 do? It's used to help make the red blood cells in our body. It's used in lots of other cells, but basically the first thing we notice when we've got a B12 deficiency is those dogs become fatigued and a bit just drowsy, and their blood count goes down. Now, as we talked about earlier, there's a thing called sports anemia. In people with sports anemia, giving vitamin B12 has shown to be beneficial even when the cause wasn't actually vitamin B12. So there's probably real benefit in giving vitamin B12. If you're giving like a normal red meat diet, you're probably already meeting your requirements, so you're not going to see a huge benefit from adding all these doses on top, but you never know, it may do something. Now, another point, I guess, is that people get really fixated on giving vitamin B12 kind of the day of injection or 2 days before or whatever. Now, vitamin B12 is extremely common, this deficiency in people, And when we medicate old people to try and help with their vitamin B12 deficiency, we give them kind of 1 injection a month or 1 injection every 3 months, and that gets them through. The liver's really good at storing vitamin B12, so even though people seem to say, I need to give my dog this injection 2 days before racing, there's not a whole lot of evidence that that's how vitamin B12 works. It's kind of given and then it's there for weeks or months, and then it's given again in weeks and months. So, you know what I mean, giving an oral supplement every day is pretty good, and I'd say as long as you're doing it responsibly, you're unlikely to go above that cobalt level. Giving an injection and feeling the need to give it on race day or 2 days before, I haven't seen a whole lot of really good evidence to say that works, but I've heard lots of people who say, look, my dog cramps if I don't give it this injection the day before. So there's lots of anecdotal evidence, but there isn't a whole lot of really good evidence in the literature that supports giving those injections close to race day. No, whoops. Magnesium, so leading on from cramping, lots of people will say that if their dog's cramping, they kind of give their dogs B12, A and P, magnesium, a few other things. There's really, really good evidence that if you're deficient in magnesium, you will cramp. There's not so good evidence that all cramps are due to magnesium deficiency. So it makes sense if you've got a dog that's cramping, you want to make sure that there's no magnesium deficiency, but probably we kind of just, it's an easy one to fix, so we give everything magnesium, but it really wasn't the cause. And usually the cause of cramping is just the dog's not fit enough, or it's not up to race fitness to be running, and that's why. And it's kind of generating too much of that lactic acid because it's just not ready yet to run at that speed. So magnesium is pretty safe, so I'd say giving it to a dog that's cramping makes sense, but it's probably not going to do a whole lot. Vitamin A, so there's a few supplements that put lots of vitamin A in there. There's pretty much no evidence that says that vitamin A actually does anything for these dogs, but it's super safe. Again, so if you wanted to overdose your dog feeding it pheromone D, you'd have to feed it like 800 scoops or something. So you know what I mean? Lots of these supplements are really safe, but I guess why waste your money on something that may not actually be working, and that's kind of the point. Fish oils, lots of good evidence for fish oils, and there's actually really good evidence in people that these things do lots and lots of good things, but the problem with fish oils is that to get that effect, to get that benefit, these studies have had to feed massive, massive doses of fish oils, and people are probably out there supplementing fish oils and they chuck a tablet or 2 tablets or something in with their dog food. Probably does nothing. So some of them are feeding 31 times the normal dose to get a little bit of benefit. So I think fish oils is probably something that's really useful and a really useful tool, but we probably need more science as to how we do it because we're probably not doing it effectively at the moment. Glucosamine. Glucosamine is probably in every pharmacy in Australia now, and there's just shelves and shelves of glucosamine, and it's just been marketed really, really well without a whole lot of evidence. So in people, maybe it does something. In dogs, again, maybe it does something, but really, for the amount of publicity that this supplement gets, I think it's a very, very overrated supplement, and there's just not that sort of evidence for it. So again, safe as houses though. So if you've got a dog with chronic arthritis or something, it's not going to hurt giving it, but if you're expecting this to be game-changing, it's probably not. So take-home message is that where you're going to get the biggest bang for your buck is looking at what your nutrients are that you're feeding out. So making sure that your ratio of fats to proteins to carbohydrates is right is where you'll get the most benefit, and that's where you're going to see a real difference. Feeding all these supplements is probably not going to do a whole lot. There's a few supplements that have really good evidence, and I really encourage people to continue using them. But I guess what I really want people to start doing is when someone says, use this, I've been using this, or do this, ask them really clearly, what's the reason? Why am I giving this, other than the fact that you've done it for 10 years and you're a good trainer and you've won a few races? Is there actually evidence for this? And if we start kind of demanding evidence as an industry, then we put the onus back on all those people who are making these supplements to say, oh, we actually need to do the research. At the moment, why would you start doing research in greyhounds when no one's going to read it, and you can just churn supplements out and whack a greyhound on the front and say that it works, and that's it. So we need to kind of be really critical when people are telling us to use supplements, and I say that as well to me, don't just take my word for it. You should be asking, if you're using supplements, you need to know exactly why you're giving that. Every single ingredient on there, you should look at it and say, okay, I'm giving that for that, I'm giving that for that, I've tested this one's blood and it was low in this, so this is why I'm giving this, not just, oh, I just, whatever, this is what I do. There's a few really good websites that if you're interested to have a look at. The IAS has basically gone through and reviewed every single supplement that is given to human athletes and kind of scored them to see if there's any evidence. And so this is a huge organisation. And they've kind of found there's probably 10 supplements that people are using that actually have any benefit at all, and the rest are just basically just marketed to people to use. So really good to have a look at. It's quite accessible, but it's quite interesting. Now, if you're interested in kind of working out what your food content is, you jump on this website and you can work out the fat and ratio of pretty much every single ingredient you can think of. Like you put in pork mince shoulder with this % fat and whatever. So it's all there. It's just how you arrange it. And if you really are interested in these sorts of supplements, I encourage you to jump on Google Scholar and a few other things and just type in the ingredients and see if there's actually any evidence at all. And 99% of the time, I promise you that there will not be a single paper or research or anything that has looked at the supplement. They just market these because in their heads they make sense. So